Tell your story about the smiling man.
I drive a long way to get home from work each day, usually along some rural roads, so my car's dash cam is usually on. Last night, though, I wish I'd turned the camera off. I'd finished my shift late, feeling drained and eager for the comfort of my own home. The moon was full, casting long, stark shadows along the empty highway. That was when I saw him by the side of the road. He stood by the tree line, a figure too tall, too thin, unnaturally dark against the moonlit landscape. He was almost like a void in the natural shadows of the trees. He wasn't looking at me, but his posture seemed alert. The moment my headlights washed over him, I noticed his face, a pale, stretched mask of a grin. That wasn't any normal smile. His lips were drawn back so wide, like they were about to split. His teeth were thin, pointed, a row of needles rather than normal human teeth. The blackness of his eyes offered no reflection, absorbing the headlights into their void-like abyss. It felt like I wasn't looking at something, more like I was staring straight into a nightmare. I sped up, hoping it was some weird reflection and trying not to let the dread crawl further up my spine. I felt sick and wished I hadn't glanced his way. A few minutes later, glancing in my mirror, my blood turned to ice. He was there, behind my car, standing unnervingly still on the shoulder of the highway. The thought alone terrified me. I looked ahead and sped up a bit more, but didn't want to cause a crash by looking into the rear mirror constantly. My dash cam recorded every single movement. As my fear was mounting, I did manage to quickly glance behind again and saw, with absolute terror, that his long and strange legs appeared to be gliding effortlessly at the same speed. He continued that movement, pacing and gliding alongside my car. The highway was totally deserted. He turned to look directly at me as the miles sped past. The unnerving and sickening smile never moved an inch. His unblinking, soulless eyes boring into me. The sheer wrongness of it caused my breathing to speed up. He kept up perfectly with my speed as I accelerated even more. His clothes were dark and loose-fitting, obscuring the details of his body, but making his silhouette even more unsettling. I got to know every single curve and twist and shape against the bright moonlight. I didn't stop the speed until I turned onto the small road of my estate, and thankfully, when I glanced back, again with fear pumping in my body, he was gone, dissolved into the shadows again, like a specter fading into thin air. My hands are still shaking when I replay the footage, when I can't comprehend the sheer size and unnatural form that is captured on that screen, when I can see him still, that terrifying, endless smile in my peripheral. He's still in my dreams. He's probably out there still. My heart aches from the constant fear. I'm putting all my footage on this video in the hope someone, anyone, will be able to explain. Please, if you know something, tell me.
The rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the streetlights into hazy halos as I hurried home. My phone was dead, and I just wanted to get inside, change into dry clothes, and forget about the mess of a day I'd had. That's when I saw him. He was across the street, near the alley entrance, partially hidden in the shadows. At first, I thought he was just a guy taking shelter from the rain, but something felt wrong. He was impossibly tall, his frame a dark, elongated silhouette against the pale glow of the city. I should have looked away then, but I didn't. And then I saw his face. It was pale, almost porcelain white, with eyes like black holes, sucking in any light that dared to touch them. And that smile. It wasn't a normal smile. It stretched from one ear to the other, impossibly wide, revealing rows of teeth that were too sharp, too many. It was a smile that held no warmth, no joy, only a chilling, predatory emptiness. My stomach clenched. I stopped walking, my heart hammering against my ribs. He started to move, his long limbs unfolding with a strange, unnatural grace. He wasn't walking towards me, exactly, but he was mirroring my movements. As I moved left, he shifted left. I tried to go right. He mirrored right again, his smile unchanging, the black eyes unblinking. It was like I was caught in some grotesque dance. The rain seemed to intensify, the noise a chaotic symphony that somehow made his movements even more silent, even more terrifying. I fumbled in my pockets for my phone, a desperate attempt to capture what I was seeing, to prove to myself that it was real. It was almost too dark to see the screen, but finally, the camera app was open, and it was capturing what was in front of me. His clothes were dark, shapeless, almost like they were made of shadows themselves. I remember noticing that his hands seemed too long, his fingers thin and elongated, like spiders' legs. Every step he took seemed to warp the space around him, a subtle distortion that made my head spin. Panic began to bubble inside me, a cold dread that seeped into my bones. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. I just stood there, frozen in place, watching him. He continued his silent, mirroring dance down the street. Then, without any warning, without any change in expression, he simply turned into the alley, dissolving into the inky blackness, as if he'd never been there. I didn't move for what felt like hours, trying to process what I had just seen. I'm sure that the video I recorded is my only proof. But the feeling I have inside is telling me that he could be anywhere. I'm terrified that I will see his smile again. I can't sleep.
It started subtly, a strange user popping up in online groups I frequented. He was called Always Smiling, and his profile picture was a distorted smiley face, nothing inherently alarming at first. But then the posts began. In forums about vintage video games, he would ask eerily specific questions about a particular glitch, referencing times when I would play late, using screenshots of my TV from an obscure angle. I wrote it off as a creepy coincidence, but the coincidences got too uncanny, far too real. On a writing forum where I share snippets of my stories, Always Smiling started leaving comments that mirrored my very thoughts as I wrote. Sometimes he'd be the first one to comment. A few times he'd reference paragraphs I'd deleted mere seconds ago, but didn't save in the system yet. I noticed each comment was on every website I joined, and they were also always perfectly and unnaturally grammatically correct. No abbreviations, always completely unnerving. My unease started to curdle in my gut, twisting into something cold and fear. The profile's icon was not a random one, in all its distortions. Every day, each iteration of the picture changed. The smile began stretching, his teeth getting sharper and whiter, his eyes like holes bored into my very existence. That was when I knew. The black eyes on each iteration looked right at me. There was nothing subtle anymore, each new image of his profile staring at me as though his gaze was following the scrolling feed through my very device. I never remembered searching the image myself. It had just started appearing more and more, all by itself. I felt watched. He knew that. I began avoiding online groups, but then his profile popped up in a friend's online party stream and a get-together with a group that had all made very specific code phrases. A closed group to get around public posts. He'd comment something small, unnerving, on the periphery of the chat. My heart rate would triple. I started changing profiles, deleting profiles, and making up random profiles with totally different interests, yet it made absolutely no difference. Always Smiling was right there, the sickening smile and unnerving eyes staring from behind each alias. His messages went from obscure and somewhat odd to blatant. I know you. Don't hide. You cannot avoid me. The messages started getting worse, always on new profiles, even from totally random IP locations. Each and every new place I appeared, he found a way in, no matter what system, no matter how secret or closed the system was. It was almost as though he could hear my thoughts online and followed from there. I stopped thinking altogether. I went to my settings and deleted absolutely every single profile I had, and deleted each and every search that I had been using, and each website it had brought me to. I turned off my phone and put it in another room. But that was the moment his picture showed up in my settings screen. That impossibly wide smile filling the place where there was supposed to be the settings picture. Always, smiling has found me now, no matter what I did. I'm done, deleting every profile and posting this message. But he's got me in some deep and truly unnerving game. He has seen it all, and he'll know. Is there no way out of this?
I've always had trouble with sleeping, especially if I fall asleep too early, or if it is quiet around me. But it always turned into an awful feeling of dread and a heaviness over my chest. I tried some self-help videos and found myself falling into deep meditative states, and it helped somewhat. I tried last night. It was so quiet in the room. My eyes snapped open sometime before morning. The air in the room was heavy, the silence oppressive. I tried to move, but my body felt encased in concrete, not an uncommon feeling in the dark stillness. But last night felt so much different. It was that sickening weight over my lungs as I knew that familiar paralysis would soon descend upon me. Except there was something more. Panic was building fast in the small gaps that came between the dark silence. As the edges of vision distorted, my breath shortening as if trying to keep out of harm's way, my gaze was pulled to the mirror. I can never bring myself to look at the mirrors in the dark. The empty places reflect my dread of the endless night and the silent spaces in my mind. What appeared was not my own tired eyes, but those two black holes of someone I could now recognize instantly, in an almost predatory and terrifying smile that was growing bigger, that I just knew meant harm. He stood behind my reflection in the glass, his face a stark, bone-white mask with that sickening grin. His smile didn't hold a touch of humanity. It was as though a cartoon nightmare had suddenly and slowly been manifested into a twisted reality. It took over the surface that once offered some sense of normality to me. It was pure, predatory glee. He looked at my face as though he knew he was on full show and wasn't fazed that it caused the fear to pulse hard and fast through my bloodstream, the panic rising high as I lay there helplessly. His teeth were impossibly sharp and narrow, his dark eyes never wavering as he watched the small panic and helpless spasms that tried to control me. With each small motion, I tried to move, tried to scream, but nothing. It was as if my voice box had ceased to function altogether. All it did was build and tighten as I started desperately pushing harder against the unyielding walls of the endless nightmare that had enveloped me. His head started to move in small movements, tilted then not, up then down. It just seemed more unsettling than it appeared, almost mocking. Then, the corners of that stretched grin seemed to reach almost right over his face, as the room itself pulsed dark, and the terrifying nightmare slowly went out like a dark flame, leaving just an echo in its stead, the knowledge that it wasn't a dream. It couldn't have been. I could feel myself coming to as soon as it was over, shaking as a shiver started down my spine. The relief as I regained full motion was followed swiftly by nausea and shaking terror. My room was still, but a piece of me was sure that it had just happened. The heavy feeling and terror that gripped me in the paralysis would live on forever. I tried to capture some movement and saw what I could. It made no sense at all, until it had happened and it was so terrifying. You've got to see for yourself.
The sounds I usually ignore became noticeable in their usual quiet ways. A door creaking, a low murmur from the next door neighbor, even the small drone of the traffic that never quite stopped. Usually, I'd sleep through it, but lately the smallest sound had begun to annoy me as they all suddenly appeared at the strangest of times. As soon as I close my eyes, it's if I am completely alone, but someone is always just close. That was when the whisper began. a low, guttural murmur, barely audible, that somehow seemed to come from everywhere at once and everywhere around my ears and down my back. I can still feel the terror of that sensation just recounting this, and one night the whispers became clearer and clearer. It wasn't like hearing a voice as someone talks to me, more like as though my mind was replaying an event with very familiar inflections and tonalities of my very own. I could even imagine the movements, each small flick of my gaze at different familiar places that used to be safe to look towards, seemed more frightening each and every time. It slowly pulled out the hidden dreads and the quiet fears that were hidden away, bringing it to full prominence at my very eyes, taunting and teasing at any normal semblance of understanding or reason. It grew more defined. You can hear me. The insidious words slithered, not through the air, but right down to the very foundations of my understanding, with all the sinister tones and patterns and inflections that you know can bring some to full panic and disarray. It called out my name, a warped and elongated pronunciation that wasn't exactly mine, or even anyone I'd ever known. It just twisted the name I used so long into a strange sound with that now infamous smile, now somehow audible with every twist and change in shape, a chilling echo in every dark crevice and shadowed space that stretched between and behind every silent breath I was forced to breathe. Every time my mind played his voice, and it got clearer, almost taunting at this stage, and making full use of the space between every synapse and each neuron, it tried its worst at trying to create any chaos that it could use to pull it closer to whatever sick end that it obviously desired. He started appearing then, or at least I think he did, on buses, through the corner of the street window. He'd be a distant, almost invisible form. His long, stretched frame was the giveaway, almost blending with shadows and then staring. If I passed people, they all would slow and stare as well, and I started running and hiding. He knew. I'd catch glimpses of his smile, not full faces, but an odd reflection on something someone was looking at. In the shop, his smile appeared in the water of the cans as it was on display. It is totally everywhere. Every sound now carries that guttural resonance, a lingering presence that sends shivers down my spine and tightens up all the airways, everywhere. His eyes never stopped staring. His face is coming closer with every new whisper. Am I going insane? It started by calling my name. Is it going to be louder and clearer next time? What could that mean? Should I just disappear and run as far as I possibly can? Maybe if he loses the echo he has been tormenting from me, he might move on to another. It's the only hope that I have. He wants it all, I am certain, so if I give it to him, what does that mean for all those he will target next?
I've been practicing lucid dreaming for a long time. Meditation, visualizations, and so forth. It has always been such an amazing outlet that allowed for exploration and the unlocking of creative space. I often tried astral projections from some tutorials that I had discovered online. Usually they didn't work, just the same dream spaces repeated themselves, or weird geometric places where I wasn't really aware of where I really was, and then woke up quickly, as if the effort of thought and imagination took over. However, last night something quite extraordinary happened and changed all that. I should have stayed in reality. I began the familiar relaxation routine, the slow breaths, the focused mind. Usually it only works after weeks of slow progressions, as I can only dream a few hours here and there. I had finally reached the right frequency and could almost hear a kind of humming sound resonating just beyond my senses. Soon I could sense a separation happening, the usual distortion that indicated it was starting. Then I left and began exploring what looked like a new, previously unexplored place, but even the small hint of dread slowly grew, twisting in me. This time the dreamscape felt different, more oppressive, somehow sinister. The usual familiar colorful kaleidoscope was missing. Everything had changed as the landscape had taken on muted gray and blue tones, a city with impossible towering buildings that looked ancient but very broken. At different places, with very tall skeletal structures that offered almost no shelter. I kept a constant focus on my silver cord, which seemed quite strong, just beyond my feet, and looked for any sign of movement in what looked like shapes, which were also almost entirely static. But there was the hint of some distant motion on my left, the familiar distortion as I tried to gaze more towards what my mind's eye saw there, just slightly hidden out of vision range. It felt very bad. And then I saw him. He stood in a distorted marketplace of the ruined and deserted buildings, the few dark shadows elongated at a totally wrong angle, casting shapes as though reality and perspective meant absolutely nothing, giving that sickly, surreal quality that has no right being there. The pale white face, contrasted with dark shadows all across, was like a terrible bruise. I couldn't tell if it was close or far. He was still, though. He also somehow knew that I could see him too. His long smile, pulled tight over his bone-like thin face, gave the terrifying and predatory nature that has become the worst and terrifying sign ever to be known or ever encountered. His eyes, as black as ink, felt heavy and deep as it watched me. As he kept on staring, slowly his body was moving, with small, almost imperceptible steps at first, making his way towards me. Panic welled up as I struggled to gain control in a lucid dream state, which usually was no problem. But this was different. Each thought to flee became an overwhelming sense of helplessness that pulled and dragged all the feelings that you might see from someone falling prey into total paralysis and total loss of all physical functions. I was frozen, unable to do anything, as the fear grew ever larger and faster in my chest and throat. As that tight, painful feeling pulled its way through me, the landscape started shifting as he moved ever closer and yet ever farther, all at the same time, as if reality and physics meant nothing there. He looked delighted, as it was as if I had no control whatsoever as to where I wanted to be when it happened. He was my tormentor here, in the middle of this nightmarish creation. I tried to force myself to wake up, the familiar pulling and tugging, but usually meant immediate return. Never happened until suddenly and abruptly, it became incredibly sharp, as if dragged against my soul at breakneck speeds, but with no feeling. Then in the flash of some terrible dream vision or nightmare vision, the images showed of the dream dimension, that is far beyond words, as if a totally unknown dimension showed that place I'd visited. And for a moment I saw him, all at once everywhere with me, with this dark red dimension. It lasted a fraction of a millisecond, then was over, as I woke suddenly with absolute, unadulterated terror. Am I truly safe from this? Please, can anyone help? What is the silver cord, and what was that awful place? Is that still real for me somewhere? It haunts my mind so dreadfully and vividly, as though part of me still roams there and was probably dragged and broken with what happened. I'm afraid to sleep.